So those who understood that the commission of Christ deserved and required their immediate and full attention decided not to wait. Welcome to episode 3 of our series. Today we're going to be discussing the Great Commission and the Diaspora, which is just a fancy word for explaining those periods in time when the Jews were resettled en masse to another location. Usually we only think about the year 70 AD when Titus captured Jerusalem, but hang with me today, you're going to learn something. Since the Great Commission is about going into all the world, why do we talk about sending others rather than going ourselves? Especially when there are other verses that adequately emphasize the sending aspect. Some say this reference was Christ speaking prophetically about the future sacking of Jerusalem. In other words, he was telling them that on that day in 30-some years, when they do finally get scattered, to make sure that they witness everywhere they go. Now, I personally doubt that interpretation, and so did Paul, Barnabas, Silas, and many others, as far as I'm concerned. The truth is, Christ gave his devout Jewish followers a task that they failed to obey. Some suggest that the Jews needed to be dispersed, the Diaspora, before the disciples could spread out to reach them. But that's just not true. They had already been dispersed for 1,000 years. In 562 BC, the Jews were already living in Cochin, India. The truth of the matter is, they had come to Cochin many years before the first apostle went there. And what we're told is that the first apostle who came to India was the Apostle Thomas. This is India, by the way, shaped like an ice cream cone. The Himalayas up here are the ice cream scoops on top. But it's believed that Thomas came down here to a town called Goa, which later was conquered. The name changed to Goa. It's a Portuguese word. And it was a Portuguese settlement for many hundreds of years in India. But then he went down from there to Cochin, then to Trivandrum, then, Sri Lanka at that time was probably connected to India instead of being an island. He came along here and evangelized in several other places. By the way, those of you who are familiar with the lady Amy Carmichael, who was a missionary in India, she was right down here at the very tip end. And it's hot down there. Thomas then came all the way up here to a city called Madras. They now call it Chennai. And there he was, some say beaten to death, some say stabbed to death, some say he was crucified. Now I've been to the alleged spot where all that happened. Well, the Jews were already living in Cochin, India, the southwest corner of the country, and they had established a trading post there. It's believed that they actually settled there during the reign of Solomon, some 500 years earlier, to traffic in teak wood, ivory, spices, and peacocks. They liked the peacocks because that's what they used to tell time with at night. Peacocks were trained to crow at certain hours of the night, so the guards knew when to change their shifts, or if you had to get up at a certain time, you knew when that was. In the New Testament, when we read about the cock crowing 3 times the night Jesus was arrested, and we assume that's a rooster, but in reality, roosters and chickens would not be imported to the Palestine area for another 200 to 300 years. So the cocks referring to there were peacocks that the Romans and the Jews used as alarm clocks during the night. So that's a little bit of history that has nothing to do with the Great Commission, but some of you will enjoy it. For another Diaspora, we look at the year 700 BC when Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, came down and took some 200,000 from not only Israel here, but Lebanon, all of Syria, even up in this region of Syria, took them back up here to his capital, and then from there he dispersed them into other areas of his kingdom. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to annihilate their culture in them. He wanted them to become Assyrians. They would eventually forget their Hebrew language or their Lebanese language or whatever. They would speak the language of the Assyrian people, the culture, the customs, the traditions. They would, in fact, become Assyrians. That was his plan, and it worked. By the way, today, when we read or hear in the news people talking about up in this area a war with the Kurds were some of those Jews that were brought up here. When we read about the Samaritans in the New Testament, they were also some of the captives that had been brought up and then migrated back later. And they were half Jewish and half local. So therefore, the Jewish priests and so forth did not consider them to be fully Jewish. So when you migrate like that, it changes everything. However, in 600 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came along. And you read a lot about him in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Daniel. He took tens of thousands of Jewish settlers from there to Babylon, where he lived. But he was the first emperor in history at that time not to try to destroy the culture of those he had conquered. He allowed them, they had to learn his culture, but they were able to keep their own. Later, after him, Cyrus would come along, and he made it a point to ensure that every captured people got to keep their own culture, speak their own language. That's why in the book of Daniel, when you read about Cyrus sending out a decree, that it was translated and sent to all the satraps, which is their word for governor. So when he made a decree, it would be translated into at least 24 different languages because he wanted them to maintain their own language. Again, that's quite a diaspora for it to be lasting this long. Then, in the year 200 BC, there was another diaspora. That's when they began slowly traveling what's called the Silk Road. That was a trading route between the Han Dynasty of China and the peoples of the West, including the Roman Empire. Many of you who don't study history well enough don't realize that the Romans here were already trading with the Chinese over here via this road right here called the Silk Road. We didn't even know about it in America until a fellow had come along named Marco Polo, and he made that route famous to us. Now, let's move on. A decade before the rule of Julius Caesar, there was a Roman governor named Lucius Valerius Flaccus who was overseeing the region of Asia Minor, which is right here, what we call today Turkey. He stated at that time that the Jewish population in Asia Minor total at least 180,000 people. That's not their total population. That's just the Jews that were living there. So that's a very great diaspora. In 27 BC, there were over 8,000 Jews living in Rome. Historians believe that it was as much as 10% of the population. And if you're like me, when you see a picture of Rome, you think, oh, that's what it looked like when Julius and Augustus were there, and it's not. The arena was built later. This wall that they have around Rome wasn't built till the 200s. So the Rome we see today is nothing like the Rome that they saw. My point to you, though, is that the Jews have been moving quite frequently throughout history. Let me give you another example. There was a philosopher named Philo, a Roman philosopher, who lived at that time in Alexandria. By saying that time, I'm talking about 27 BC. He wrote that there were more than 1 million Jews living in Egypt. He said that at least 1/8 of the population of Alexandria, which had the second largest number of Jews behind any place in the world other than Jerusalem, he said that at least 1 out of 8 people in Alexandria were Jewish. That's incredible. When you think you'd walk down the road to go to the market to buy something, 1 out of every 8 people you passed would have been Jewish. In fact, there were so many Jews living in Egypt at that time that the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem authorized them to build a second temple far down the Nile, or up the Nile, depending on how you look at it. And they were allowed to have a second Jewish temple. So the one in Jerusalem was not the only one. There was another one in Egypt, although it was conquered and destroyed, I think, around 400 BC. It was there, however, that they developed a writing of something called the Septuagint. It's also referred to as the 70. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, why did they need a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament if they're Jews? Because they were living in Egypt. Their parents were born there, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents. If you recall, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were from Egypt, and that Jesus spent a part of his early life in Egypt. As a result of these generations upon generations living in Egypt, many of them forgot how to speak Hebrew. They spoke Greek. So they needed an Old Testament, a Bible, if you will, that they could read. So the leaders, the Jewish rabbis and so forth, the high priest, his council in Jerusalem gave them permission to write a new one that's in the Greek language, and they authorized it. And by the way, when you read in the scripture about Jesus referring to what the prophets said or wrote, he was quoting not from the Torah, the Hebrew translation, but from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, all these diasporas occurred before Jesus gave the prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem, which would take place in 70 AD. That, again, is what we call the Great Diaspora. Jerusalem was destroyed. Some writers who lived in that day say as many as 500,000 of the inhabitants that lived around there were slaughtered in the streets. That blood ran ankle and knee deep in the streets. We don't know if that's exactly correct, but what we do know is that Jerusalem was destroyed and all the Jews fled. And we call that the Great Diaspora. So those who understood that the commission of Christ deserved and required their immediate and full attention decided not to wait, but to proceed as best they could, fulfilling the task and trusting God to make the best of their labors. They produced fruit that remains, of which you and I are included. Others got on board late, but when it comes to obeying the Great Commission, better late than never applies to both them and to us.
The term diaspora does not define one particular dispersal of the Jews, AD 70, but any and every dispersal, including Jacob's moving his family to Egypt and Moses leading them out to Canaan. What modern-day diasporas with refugees have you witnessed? How have past diasporas influenced your community? Did you know when people arrive in their new homeland, they are most acceptable to hear the good news of Jesus Christ from a friendly citizen? How can you share the gospel with them?
We hope you've enjoyed this episode in our Understanding the Great Commission series. If you'd like a copy of the book, it's available in paperback, audiobook, and digital download. Just click the link in the description below. Thank you for watching.